The details of this case are fabricated and designed to highlight teaching points. In the United States, every nonprofit organization must have a governing body made up of mainly volunteers. While the duties of a nonprofit board member, including duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience, seem easy enough, sometimes things can become more complicated. Debbie tells her story.
I had started to notice an increase in the homeless population on my way to work. I would often drive by many individuals. They had their hands out and their signs out, and my heart broke for them. I knew that I wanted to help. A group of us from my local church started talking, and we decided that we needed to do something. I started researching and learning what it would take to start a homeless shelter. The rules and details seemed so complicated, and I quickly became overwhelmed. However, to help us navigate these details and these rules, we set up an appointment with Tony. He was the director of the shelter 80 miles away in another town. We knew he could offer guidance because he had so much experience in this area. Tony shared so much information, and we were amazed at his professionalism, charisma, and his heart for helping. He gave us guidance and best practices. He talked to us about how to afford it, how to raise money, and he told us what mistakes we needed to watch out for. After leaving that meeting, the group and I gathered for coffee so that we could discuss what all we had learned. During that coffee meeting, someone stepped up and said, "Wouldn't it be great if we could get Tony to be our director? He would bring so much to the table and he could help us make a real difference in our community." Some of the members of our group decided to approach Tony and see if he'd be interested in helping and perhaps even becoming our first executive director. We had worked really hard with fundraising, and we had already raised enough to guarantee him a salary. And we all know that his expertise was so needed. To our surprise, Tony said that he was interested, but he would not leave his current job right away. However, instead, he would work on our board of directors and help us with all the paperwork and getting everything in order. Then he said once we got everything in order, he would come over and he would be our first director. We looked forward to his guidance and we hit the ground running. Tony helped us to make all the right contacts, and he started talking to donors on our behalf. We still needed a place to house the mission and staff to help bring it together, but with his expertise, we were quickly able to meet the right people. Also, he said that he was going to be able to bring over workers from his other job. In fact, Tony knew of a caseworker and a counselor from the other shelter that would be willing to move over to ours. Even Tony's wife, who was the bookkeeper of the other mission, agreed to move over and be our bookkeeper. Things were going just as planned, and it was so exciting seeing the progress. One particular board meeting, Tony showed up to share with us that he had found a place that we would be able to rent to house the shelter. He had found an individual donor who wished to remain anonymous, but this donor said that we could rent his building for $2,000 a month and had permission to remodel it so that it could be what we needed it to be. We quickly agreed to these terms and invested $100,000 in remodeling this property. We relied on a lot of work and labor from volunteers who helped us to remodel the inside. After a lot of hard work, we had an operational and functioning homeless shelter. It did not take long for the news to spread. Within a few months, we were full. It was so gratifying going into the shelter and seeing all the men and women that we were helping. I was so proud to be a part of this work, and I was so proud of all that we had accomplished. Unfortunately, it did not take long for the tides to turn. After only being open for a few months, Tony came to one of our board meetings and wanted to share with us a concern. It seemed that some of the nearby residents in the neighborhood were starting to petition to have our mission closed. We took this concern very seriously. Tony assured us that this is no big deal. He said it was very common for this to happen, and he even showed us the following news sample of residents doing the same thing to another shelter a few towns down.
This is Sarah with the Nonprofit News. We are here talking to neighborhood residents about why they are petitioning the City Council to shut down the East Texas Rescue Mission. Sir, would you like to comment?
Yeah, we live about 4 houses down from the mission, and my wife and I were getting ready to go to bed, and then we heard a knock on the door. But I answered it. It was one of those mission people asking for $30. I mean, this is getting ridiculous.
And here's some younger residents telling us about their experience.
We were outside playing in the fence, and some homeless man came up and started talking to us. Mommy was really scared.
And you, sir, I hear you own a business here.
I run a restaurant in the neighborhood, and I have a lot of homeless people coming up to the folks that are sitting outside and begging for money, begging for food, just generally harassing them. And my business is down 60% since that homeless shelter opened down there. And I'm really upset about the loss of business that I have. I want to help the homeless. I want to help the shelter, but I can't do it if I have to lay my people off.
Again, this was Sarah with the Nonprofit News.
While we wanted to have a good relationship with the neighbors, it became obvious that their demands and requirements were unreasonable. They blamed our residents for everything that went wrong. Anytime there was a scrap of paper on the sidewalk, they automatically assumed that it was our residents who did it. Also, as part of their petition, they said they wanted us to refuse services to criminals or anyone with a background record, and they demanded that we run background checks on every individual who came into the shelter. Did they have any idea how much money that would cost? And the fact is, we are there to help those most in need. The newspaper outlets started to contact us as board members. They wanted to know our view. We had an emergency board meeting and decided that it would be best for us to not respond, but instead to have one public face, and that would be Tony. And Tony would be the one talking to everyone. However, with every news article and news segment, it seemed that the issue was getting bigger and bigger. More people wanted to know what was going on. These people were calling me all the time. Friends, church members, people that I served on other nonprofit boards with, they wanted to know what was happening. Even other nonprofits were calling to find out what was happening. This volunteer opportunity was actually starting to impact other areas of my life. It was starting to feel like a full-time job, and it was taking away from the time that I could be spending with my family. Honestly, the steady barrage of emails, phone calls, they started to take their toll, and I really just wanted it all to stop. I actually considered quitting the board of directors, and my family encouraged me to. They kept reminding me that I already have a full-time job and that this volunteer opportunity was taking over my life. At our next board meeting, Tony shared some very surprising news. He said that the neighbors had been calling the fire marshal and the cops and the city council members, and as a result, all these different groups had started touring the shelter. Unfortunately, when the fire marshal came to tour the shelter, he noticed that we had too many beds. You see, the volunteers didn't understand that we were only permitted for a certain number of beds, and so they actually saw some blank space in a back room and they built additional bunks in case we ever wanted to expand. But having these additional bunks was a violation of the building code and our permit. We were all very worried because it was obvious that we had violated the city ordinance. What did this mean to the mission and those who came to depend on us? What did this mean for the other nonprofits who sent their clients to us? What did this mean to the men and women who used us every night to get a hot, fresh meal and to feed their kids? What were we supposed to do? However, Tony stepped in with all of his confidence and assured us that it was not really that big a deal. He simply shared that we needed to get a special use permit and that he had already filed the paperwork. We all left the meeting, very uncomfortable, but at least he was taking care of it. The next few days after that, I tried to call Tony a few times, but he was never available. I started to become even more worried when some of the other board members had the same experience. It seems that we were having a hard time getting in touch with him. However, we all understood he was so busy with everything that was taking place. One morning, I was awoken by a phone call. I picked it up, and it was a reporter on the other end. As soon as I picked up the phone, she started peppering me with questions. What will you do now that the city has required you to shut down the mission? What will your next steps be? What will happen to the men who live there and the women who use the services? And why did you invest over $100,000 of the organization's money in Tony's personal property? I hung up as quickly as I could. I didn't even know what she was talking about. I called the other board members and we had an emergency board meeting without Tony. In that meeting, more of the information was shared. Some of the board members had started doing their own digging and looking into Tony and the finances of the organization. And it seems that anonymous donor who was letting us rent their place for $2,000 a month, that anonymous donor was Tony. Why didn't he just tell us? It seems that the city council was giving us just a few days to shut down and vacate the property. Additionally, it seems that the property that we had invested $100,000 in and countless hours of volunteer effort and labor, that property belonged to Tony. It was his personal property that we improved. This was all so devastating. But then I remembered, I'm just a board member. This isn't my full-time job. I already have one of those. The answer, for me, became very clear.